Welcome to a new episode from English Plus Podcast. In today's episode, we will talk about common mistakes we usually make when we talk about adjectives comparison and sequence. Now let's talk first about adjectives comparison. I will start with a mistake, and I really want you to think about the mistake, maybe pause the episode and think about how we can correct this mistake. And then, of course, I will tell you how to correct the mistake, what the mistake is all about, and why we're doing what we're doing. But before we start this episode, let me remind you that you can find the transcript of this episode in a link I will leave in the description, and you can also find a link to our Patreon page where you can become a patron of the show and support us and help us create more episodes in English Plus Podcast. And of course, you will have our never-ending gratitude, and you will have the exclusive custom-made PDF practice worksheets for every single episode we create only for our patrons. So, with that being said, let's dive in and let's start with our very first sentence. Gas is usually more cheap than electricity. So, what's wrong with this sentence? Think about it. You might want to pause the episode and think about it on your own and try to figure out what's wrong with this sentence. Let me say it again. Gas is usually more cheap than electricity. Now, the problem with this sentence is that most one-syllable adjectives form their comparatives and superlatives with ER or EST. We say, my brother is younger than I am, or this is the tallest building in Montreal. Now, participles used as adjectives are exceptions. We say, I've never felt more bored in all my life. The two front tires look more worn. So these are participles and these are exceptions. We use more or most with them. But here, if we look back, what did we use? We said cheap and we said more cheap. So do you think that's possible or do you think that's okay? No, it's not. This is a common mistake we use with adjectives comparison. And what we should say gas is usually cheaper than electricity, not gas is usually more cheap than electricity. So that was our first sentence. Let me give you now our second two sentences. He is one of the most rudest men I've ever met, and the medicine made me feel much more better. What's wrong with these two sentences? Let me say them again. He is one of the most rudest men I've ever met, and the medicine made me feel much more better. What's wrong with these two sentences? Now, the problem with these two sentences is that we do not use an ER or EST form and more or most together. It's either ER, EST, or more and most, not together. For example, rudest is a superlative form and is not used with most. Better is a comparative form and is not used with more. So here, what we said, he's one of the most rudest. We used most with EST. And in the second one, we said much more better. We said more and better. You might be fooled because better is not a regular comparative because, of course, better is the comparative form of good and the superlative form is the best. And since we're talking about this, let me also tell you about bad and the comparative form is worse. The superlative form is the worst. But here, coming back to better, better is the comparative form. So we use the comparative form in better. We don't need more. So that's the problem. Instead of he is one of the most rudest men I've ever met, we should say he's one of the rudest men I've ever met without most. And in the second one, instead of saying the medicine made me feel much more better, we should only say the medicine made me feel much better. That's it. Better without more. We don't need more. And now for the next example. It is oldest university in Europe. Think about it. Pause the episode, think about it, and try to come up with a correction and try to know why. Try to think about it and figure out why it is wrong and how we can correct the sentence. It is oldest university in Europe. Now, before a superlative adjective like oldest, we normally use the or a possessive determiner like my, her, their, etc. For example, we say, this is the tallest building in Boston, the tallest, because it's the one. We're talking about only one here. Have you read her latest novel? So here it's okay to use a possessive determiner instead of the, like when we said here, her latest novel. And when a noun phrase ends with a qualifier, like if we say in Europe, for example, that's a qualifier, we use the. For example, we say she is the youngest girl in my class, or it is the worst film that I've ever seen. So, with that being said, let's go back to this example I gave you. It is oldest university in Europe. We have a qualifier here, and it is a superlative, and we don't have the, and we don't have a possessive adjective, so there's something wrong. There's something missing. What we should say it's the oldest university in Europe, not oldest on its own. And now let's move on to two more examples. My most favorite subject is history, and cheap products are often more inferior. What's wrong with these two sentences? Let me say them again. My most favorite subject is history, and cheap products are often more inferior. So, what's wrong? Some adjectives are not normally used either with er, est, or with more or most because they have a comparative or superlative meaning already. Someone's favorite subject, for example, is the one that they like the most. So we don't use comparative and superlative forms with them at all. Now, we have other words that attract this type of mistake, and these words are complete, equal, favorite, ideal, inferior, perfect, superior, or unique. These words have a meaning on their own, and the meaning of comparative and superlative is there already. So they are not normally used with er, est, or more and most for comparative and superlative. So here, going back to these two examples I gave you, my most favorite subject is history. We don't say my most favorite subject is history. We just say my favorite subject is history. Because favorite on its own means the subject I like the most. So we don't need to use the most. And the next one, we said cheap products are often more inferior. Inferior has the meaning of comparative. And we're talking about something that is better and something that is inferior, something of a higher quality, something of an inferior quality. So inferior on its own doesn't need comparative. We say it, cheap products are often inferior, period, without more. Now, with that being said, let me move to the next example we have talking about adjectives comparison and the common mistakes we usually make when we try to use adjectives in comparative and superlative form. Singapore is cleaner than Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is the most interesting. Now, what's wrong with that? Singapore is cleaner than Hong Kong, that's fine, but Hong Kong is the most interesting. I don't find any problem with the form itself. But there's a problem in the meaning, and there's a problem in the number of people or things we're trying to compare to each other. Here, when we compare just two people or things, we use er or more, or comparatives, especially in formal styles. We use est and most or more than two. So here, if we go back to our example, we can see clearly that we're just talking about two things, which are two cities in this example. We're talking about Singapore and we're talking about Hong Kong. So Singapore is cleaner, and that's good. But then we said Hong Kong is the most interesting. We're not saying most interesting in the world or in the area or in Asia. We're not comparing Hong Kong to many cities. We're just talking about Singapore and Hong Kong, only two. So we should say more interesting. So again, the sentence should be Singapore is cleaner than Hong Kong, but Hong Kong is more interesting. We're still talking about two, we're still comparing two things, two cities to each other. And now let's move on to the last common mistake I will talk about when it comes to comparison. Let's think about these two sentences together. There are so many good shops that it is easiest for people to buy what they want. And the second sentence, we must not forget that some criminals are the richest people. So, what's wrong with that? Think about it. Maybe pause the episode and think about it. Try to figure out how to fix the errors in these two sentences, and why are you fixing the errors this way? When we simply want to intensify an adjective, like what we're trying to do here, we use very, extremely, etc. We do not use est or most unless we are making a comparison. For example, we say Simon's new computer is very easy to use. Very easy to use. There's nothing to compare it with. I'm just saying it is very easy. We want to intensify an adjective, and that's what we do. But look at this sentence now. Of the three computers, the XT2 is the easiest to use. Here, of course, we can use comparative forms, and in this case, superlative. Because I'm talking about three computers. I'm comparing three computers to each other, and I came up with the conclusion that the XT2 is the easiest to use. But I'm just talking about three computers. I'm not just talking about one computer, and I'm trying to intensify the adjective. So going back to our examples, we said there are so many good shops that it is easiest for people to buy what they want. There's no need to use easiest here. What we should say, there are so many good shops that it is very easy for people to buy what they want. That's it. It's very easy. It's not easiest. We don't need to use superlative form here. And in the second one, we have the same case. We must not forget that some criminals are the richest people. We don't have to say the richest. We can simply say are very rich people. So with that being said, I hope we cleared some of the common mistakes that people usually make when they use adjectives comparative forms. And now let's move on to talk about adjective sequence, which can be tricky sometimes because there is a very specific sequence we use adjectives in. So let me give you this first example. Each child was given a red, beautiful balloon. If you look at this, what's wrong with that? But here, since we're talking about adjectives, I want you to focus on the sequence of adjectives in the sentence. Each child was given a red, beautiful balloon. So I described the balloon with two adjectives, red and beautiful. What's wrong with saying red, beautiful balloon? Well, when we use two or more adjectives before a noun, we normally put those which express opinions and impressions, like beautiful, before those which express facts, like red. So we say, for example, an unusual pink dress. Now, pink is a fact. It's not an opinion. It's not my opinion about the dress that it is pink, and then somebody else will come and think it is yellow. No, it is pink. It's a fact. But when I say unusual, that's my opinion. That's how I see the dress. So opinions come before facts. That's the first thing you need to know about for sequencing your adjectives. And another example before we move back to this sentence I gave you, a wonderful Italian pizza. Now, here, when we say Italian pizza, Italian is not my opinion. Italian is the fact. It is Italian. It comes from Italy, or the person who made it is Italian, or they made it in an Italian style, etc. That is a fact. But what is the opinion here is wonderful. So we can't say Italian wonderful pizza. We cannot use the fact before the opinion. We should use the opinion first, and then we go on and talk about the fact. So a wonderful Italian pizza. Now, going back to this example I gave you, each child was given a red, beautiful balloon. Now you know, red is a fact, beautiful is an opinion, so we should use the opinion first, and we should say each child was given a beautiful red balloon. And now let's think about these two sentences. She has married a young, tall Australian accountant, and it has black, short hair and very sharp teeth. Here, it is a little bit more confusing than the first example, because when we think about it, young, tall, Australian, they're all facts. They're not opinions. When we talk about black, short hair, we're not talking about opinions. It's black, it's short, these are facts. So how can we sequence our adjectives in this case? Well, there is actually a fixed sequence for adjectives. We start with the size, age, shape, color, origin, material, and purpose. Let me give you some examples about the size. Size, like when we say small or long. Age, when we say old or new. The shape, when we say round, square, etc. The color, green, white, red, blue. The origin, like when we say German, Italian, French. The material, when we say plastic or silk. And the purpose, when we say kitchen or car, that means we use it in the kitchen, we use it in the car. Of course, kitchen and car, they're not adjectives, but they're nouns that we can use as adjectives, and they're usually used as adjectives of purpose. Why do we use this? Let me give you an example. An old green kitchen table. An old, that's an age, color, then the green, and then we have the purpose, kitchen, and we're talking about a table that we can use in the kitchen that is green and old. And another example we can say about the shampoo, for example, a new German car shampoo. So a new, that's the age, German, that's the origin, purpose, that's for cars, not for the hair. It's not hair shampoo. That's a purpose adjective, and then shampoo. So Once again, you need to take note of this thing specifically because it's very difficult to remember, to be honest. And you don't have to think about it every time you want to make a sentence. It's okay sometimes to make a mistake like this. It's not the end of the world. But if you want to revise your language and if you want to make perfect sentences, you might want to think about the sequence of adjectives that we use in English. We use the size first, the age next, the shape, then the color, the origin, the material, the purpose, and of course, then the noun. So here, back when we have those examples, we said young, tall Australian. So young, we use the age. Tall, we use the size, and we know we should use size before age. So that's the first mistake. And Australian is the origin. It's fine. We're using it later. So what we should say in the first sentence, she has married a tall young Australian accountant, not a young tall. In the second one, we said black short hair. We used the color first, and then we used the size, which is short. And that's a mistake. We use size, age, shape, color. So color comes after size. Obviously, we should say it has short black hair and very sharp teeth. So let's move on to talk about another example. The tree was a great comfort during the midday scorching sun. What's wrong with that? Here, a noun used as an adjective like midday. Here we said a tree was a great comfort during the midday scorching sun. Midday is a noun, but we use it as an adjective. When we do this, a noun used as an adjective like midday, it goes immediately before the noun. And in this case, is the sun. So we say, for example, an exciting detective story, expensive leather shoes, an excellent evening meal. Here we have detective story. Detective is a noun, and we use it here as an adjective to describe the kind of story. Leather shoes. We're talking about leather, which is a noun, and we're describing the shoes with it. So we're using it as an adjective. Or evening meal. What kind of meal? It's the evening meal. That's also a noun we use to describe another noun, so we use it as an adjective. And when we have nouns used as adjectives, we use it before the noun. It goes immediately before the noun. Now, when there are two nouns used as adjectives, we put material before purpose. So here, like we say, a nylon swimming costume. Nylon is the material, swimming is the purpose. A cheap plastic medicine cupboard. So cheap plastic, that's the material, comes first, and then comes the purpose. That's a medicine cupboard. It's not to store anything else. And a long steel exhaust pipe. So here we have steel, that's the material, and exhaust, that's the purpose. So going back to our sentence, the tree was a great comfort during the midday scorching sun. We know by now that we should use the midday before the noun, immediately before the noun. So we should say the tree was a great comfort during the scorching midday sun. And now for the next example, and it's the last example for today. We bought 6 handmade very old wine glasses. We bought 6 handmade very old wine glasses. Well, it sounds awkward, but what's wrong with it? Now, the problem here is gradable adjectives, which means those that can be used with very. Now, those gradable adjectives normally come before ungradable adjectives. For example, we say famous medical school. Now, here you're still thinking, I still don't get it. What is gradable adjective? Well, let's take a look. A famous medical. Can you say very famous? Yeah, sure, of course. It can be very famous. It can be famous. That's okay. So it is gradable. We have many grades for this adjective. It is not just black and white. It could be famous or very famous or extremely famous. But what about medical? Can we say it is a medical school? It is a very medical school? Doesn't make any sense. What does that mean? It's medical. That's it. It's not gradable. It's ungradable. And this is a good example of ungradable adjectives. So when we use gradable adjectives, we usually use them before ungradable adjectives. So in this case, we said famous before medical because famous is gradable, medical is not. And another example, an old carved pictured frame. For carved, it is either carved or not, or something else. But we don't say very carved. But what about old? Of course, yeah, old can be old and can be very old. So it is gradable. Old is gradable, carved is not. So we use old before carved because old is gradable and carved is not. Another example before we move back to our sentence, a beautiful embroidered dressing gown. The same here. Beautiful can be very beautiful. It is gradable. Embroidered, well, it cannot be very embroidered. It is embroidered or it's not. So here we use gradable before ungradable. And back to our sentence, we bought 6 handmade, very old wine glasses. What's wrong with that? Of course, we have old that is gradable and handmade that is ungradable. So we should use old before handmade. So we should say, we bought 6 very old handmade wine glasses. We use old, which is gradable, before handmade, which is ungradable. With that being said, I hope that you learned new things that will help you make fewer mistakes, especially when you want to talk about adjectives comparison and sequence. Now, let me remind you that you can find the transcript of this episode in a link I will leave in the description, and you will also find a link that will take you to Patreon, where you can become a patron of this show and support English Plus Podcast and help us continue. And with that, you will have our everlasting gratitude, but not only our gratitude, you will also have our exclusive PDF practice worksheet that is custom made for every single episode we release. You will get that if you become a patron on Patreon. So invest in your own learning and at the same time support our journey in English Plus Podcast. With that being said, I would like to thank you very much for listening to another episode from English Plus Podcast. This is your host, Danny. I will see you next time.